Hello everyone, welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. Today we are going to make a delicate lace weight shawl, perfect for tossing around your shoulders if you're going out into a cool summer evening or perhaps a fancy do like a wedding or a garden party. We'd like to thank Lion Brand Yarns for sponsoring today's video, and today's shawl was made using Summer Nights by Lion Brand. You can check out their website, we've put a link in the description box down below, and you can check out all the pretty different colorways that the Summer Nights yarn comes in. Today's stitch pattern will be very familiar to anyone who did the Victorian Stitch Sampler calendar blanket along with us last year. We've decided to use the July stitch, which is the Old Country Bridges stitch. It's a beautiful, lacy, fine little pattern that makes for a perfect shawl in the hot weather. And for the border, we've used a very simple split shell stitch on repeat to just change up the pattern a little bit to define the difference between the shawl and the border. I love how these two patterns work together, and I feel like it made a very pretty little shawl. The yarn we're using today falls into the size 1 weight category, also known as superfine and occasionally lace weight. So it's a very small yarn. That combined with a small hook creates this beautiful, drapey, delicate sort of fabric that's perfect for a summery shawl. And I especially like the Summer Nights yarn for this project because it has a little bit of a twinkle that runs through it, and I feel something like a firefly when I'm wearing this outside at night. So let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table, and we will stitch up a lovely, lacy, summery shawl together. In order to make our Old Country Bridges wrap, I have 2 balls of Summer Nights by Lion Brand. Each of these balls is 200 grams or 875 yards, so there's a lot of yarn in each ball. However, it is a superfine, also known as a size 1 or a sock weight yarn, so it's very, very fine yarn, which means our stitches are going to be nice and small. This particular color is Treasure Island. You're also going to need a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and the hook we're using today is a size 3.25 millimeter, also known as a D or a 3 in the US, a size 10 in the UK. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please take a moment to click that button and the bell so you never miss another episode. And once you've got all that together, we can get started. First, a quick word on superfine or sock weight size 1 yarn. Because it's so small, it does want to tangle a little easier than other yarns do. So I recommend if you're pulling your yarn from the outside, so if you've got the outside end of the ball, keep your ball in a bowl and allow it to roll around on the inside of the bowl. That will help keep it from getting tangled. If you're pulling your yarn from the inside, so if you've got the inside tail and you're pulling from the inside of the ball, pull out a little bit of yarn at a time, use it up, and then pull out a little bit more. This will help keep it from tangling up and you won't end up with any snags. The Old Country Bridges stitch can be worked over a foundation chain row that is any multiple of 6. I have found that using this size yarn and this hook, you'll get roughly 6 chains to the inch. So I'm going to begin with a foundation chain row that is 300 chains. You might find it helpful to count out 10, 50 or even 100 chains and then mark that last chain with a stitch marker. It makes it easier to count up all of your chains when you've finished your foundation row so that you can ensure that you have the right number of stitches. Once you have 300 or a chain length that is a multiple of 6, make sure you count it a couple times. These are very small chains and you want to be sure that your foundation chain row is an exact multiple of 6. It's very important, otherwise the little stitch pattern isn't going to work properly. As you can see, I've marked every 100 chains with a stitch marker or a safety pin, just so I can keep track of my counts. We're going to begin in the 12th chain from the hook. So you're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So take a moment, find the 12th chain from the hook, maybe count it twice if your eyesight's not as good as it used to be. We're going to V-stitch into that 12th chain from the hook, so it helps if you can keep your thumb and forefinger on it. We're going to double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, all into that 12th chain. So that first double crochet might be a little tricky. It's very fine yarn, so be patient. The first 2 rows of this pattern may take you a little longer, but that's perfectly understandable because we are just getting the pattern foundation sort of established, and because it's very fine yarn, it might be a bit fiddly. So especially while you're working across your foundation row, make sure you stop every so often to make sure that your chains haven't twisted on you, because you don't want to accidentally miss or double use some. After we've got a double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, or a V-stitch worked into that 12th chain from the hook, we're going to chain 3, skip 5 chains, find the 6th one, and work a double crochet, chain 1, double crochet into it, or a V-stitch. So like I said, this first little establishing row might take you a little while, so be patient. Working small isn't easy. If your yarn wants to twist on you, like mine just did, just gently take it out, put your hook back in, and recount your chains. It will get easier, I promise. And then we're going to repeat. So we are going to be working V-stitches separated by 3 chains and separated by 5 chains down below all the way across. So once you complete a V-stitch, chain 3, count 5 chains, find the 6th one, and work the next V-stitch into it. So 5 chains skipped down below, 3 chains created in between your V-stitches. You're going to work that all the way across. It's quite a long foundation row, so take your time, no need to rush, and I'll catch up with you at the end. Okay, that was quite a slog. Don't worry, it gets much quicker from here on out. You have a V-stitch, which is double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, worked into every 6th chain all the way along your foundation chain row, and they're separated by 3 chains up top. So 5 chains underneath, 3 chains up top. When you get across to the end, you should have 6 chains left after your last V-stitch, chain 3. If you have 5 chains or 7 chains, that's fine. Don't think to yourself, oh my gosh, I've got to do this whole thing all over again. Even if you have 4 chains, just pretend that you have 6th and work a double crochet into the last chain. So even if you have to cheat, don't worry about it. It's not going to show in the grand scheme of things. So you're going to end with a double crochet in that last chain, and that is the foundation of our stitch pattern all finished. At the end of row 1, we're going to chain 5 and turn. Row 2 is going to move a little faster. So row 2 is the even row of the pattern. We've chained 5 and turned. This is the chain 3. So in between your V-stitches, remember you've made a chain 3, so that's called the chain 3 space. Into this space, you're going to work a single crochet. You're going to chain 2, find the V-stitch, so the next V-stitch from the row before, and work a V-stitch into it. So double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, all worked into that same V-stitch. So you're always going to work a V-stitch into the top of another V-stitch. So it looks something like this so far. There we go. Let's get a couple more in. We're going to chain 2, find the chain 3 space, there it is right there, it's really big, hard to miss, single crochet into the middle of it, chain 2, find the next V-stitch, there it is, and work a V-stitch into the middle of it. So chain or double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. That's the little pattern you're going to work all the way across for row 2. Chain 2, single crochet into the middle of the big chain 3 space, chain 2, V-stitch into the top of the V-stitch from the previous row, chain 2, And repeat, single crochet into the middle of that big chain 3 space from the previous row. Always chain 2 between your little motifs, V-stitch into the V-stitch, and so on. I'll see you at the end of row 2. At the end of row 2, you should see our pretty little bridge pattern taking shape. We single crochet in the big chain 3 space, chain 2, work a V-stitch into the top of the V-stitch from the previous row, chain 2, and start all over again. Single crochet in the big space, chain 2, V-stitch in the top of the V-stitch, chain 2. Single crochet in the big space, chain 2, V-stitch in the top of the V-stitch from the previous row, chain 2. So you've worked that all the way across. When you get to the end of row 2, you've got your big loop on the end. That's the chain 12 that we skipped at the beginning. We're going to work a V-stitch into the top of our last V-stitch, chain 2, single crochet into that big loop, chain 2, and it is helpful to identify the 4 chains away from the end of your last V-stitch. So if you pull up on that, there's your last V-stitch of the row previous. Count around 4 chains, doesn't have to be exact, try to find 4 chains, and just work a double crochet in the 4th chain away from the end of the V-stitch of the previous row. So basically what you're doing is just trying to create a nice straight edge. This is the one weird end because we're just coming to the end over top of row 1, and of course we started with that foundation chain, so it's not going to look like that from here on out. And from here on out, as your work gets heavier and longer, you'll have a little more weight pulling against you, which will help make your stitches easier and faster. So don't fret if getting to the end of row 2 felt like it took forever. It will speed up from here on out for 2 reasons. A, you're going to get used to the pattern, and B, all of that weight is going to help speed things along. So at the end of row 2, which is an even row, we're going to chain 6 and turn. Row 3 is an odd row, and it's the same for every odd row from here on out, just as row 2 is an even row, and it's the same for every even row from here on out. This is a 2-row pattern repeater, and I feel that the odd row, row 3, what we're about to do, is the quicker of the 2 rows, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. After you've chained 6 and turned at the end of an even row, find the first V-stitch from the row before and work a V-stitch into the very middle of it. So double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So the beginning of row 3 should look something like this. Then we chain 3, find the next V-stitch from the row before and V-stitch into that. And that's all you have to do all the way across for every odd row. You V-stitch in the top of every V-stitch, chain 3 in between, and then find the next V-stitch from the row previous and work a V-stitch into the top of that. V-stitch is double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. Remember that you're working 3 chains in between each one, and it should look something like this. At the end of row 3, or every odd row, work your last V-stitch into the top of the last V-stitch, chain 3, and find the top of the chain 3 from the row before. So just find the bottom of those chains that you turned with, count up 3, and work a double crochet right into the top of that 3rd chain. Doesn't have to be exact, but it helps if you count up from the bottom. And that's how you end every odd row. So at the end of every odd row, you're going to chain 5 and turn. At the end of every even row, you're going to chain 6 and turn. So we chain 5 because we're at the end of an odd row, and we turn. Every even row is just like row 2. You begin with a single crochet in that big space up front, the chain 3 space, chain 2, and V-stitch into the top of the V-stitch. So remember, every single row you're putting a V-stitch in the top of the V-stitch from the previous row. But in the even rows, you're kind of breaking up the big spaces. So after you finish a V-stitch, chain 2, find that big space and work a single crochet into it. Don't forget to chain 2, and then get to your next V-stitch and work a V-stitch into it. Don't forget to chain 2 after your V-stitch and go right back into a single crochet. And that's all you have to do for an even row. So from here on out, you're going to repeat rows 2 even and rows 3 odd, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until your wrap is as tall as you want it to be. So we've already established the width with our foundation row. Now we are making it long, or think of it as the nice amount of coverage that you want when you wrap up in it. So you can repeat this as often as you want. You could make an entire bedspread out of this technically, but we're actually working on a shawl today. So go ahead, repeat rows 2 and 3, or even and odd, until your shawl or wrap is as tall as you want it to be. When you get to the end of every even row, remember to work your V-stitch on top of the last V-stitch, chain 2, single crochet in that big space that's left, chain 2, and then count up 3 from the bottom. So 1, 2, 3. It's a little difficult to see, but try to count up from the bottom evenly. Find the top of the 3rd chain and double crochet into the top of it. At the end of every even row, we chain 6 in turn. At the end of every odd row, we chain 5 in turn. I'll see you a few more rows in. I have now completed 63 rows in total of the Old Country Bridges stitch. So every row has 48 V-stitches in it, and that was based on a 300 foundation chain starting point. My wrap currently measures 40 inches or 100 centimeters long, so from left to right, and 18 inches or 46 centimeters from top to bottom. Now it doesn't matter how many rows you add to your wrap, you can make this as tall as you want it to be. Just be sure that you end on an odd row, and an odd row is the V-stitches separated by 3 chains each. This way it will match the first row we did, which of course was an odd row, and you want those same big 3 chain spaces running across the top and the bottom. It doesn't matter how many rows you add or how many foundation chains you began with, so long as you use the formula. The border we're going to add now will still work, just be sure that you end on an odd row. For our border, we are going to use a split shell pattern. And the lovely thing about this split shell pattern is that you can do as many border rows as you want. So if you got started and you felt that your shawl needed to be a little bit wider, a little bit longer, you can continue to add border rows to increase the width and the length of your wrap. If your wrap is pretty much exactly where you want it measurement wise, you need only add a couple rows of the border just to finish off those nice big open spaces, and you will be finished. So at this point you can decide how much border you want to add. It's the exact same pattern every single row. We're going to start by working down the first short side of our wrap. We are already in a big space, and all you're going to focus on are the big spaces. So you're going to ignore the little ones, you're just going to focus on the big ones going down and up both sides. We're going to begin with a chain 3. This chain 3 will count as a double crochet, and we're going to double crochet into that space. So we're working into the spaces, not into individual stitches. Chain 2, and work 2 more double crochet into that same big space. That is a split shell. So it's 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, or in this case we chained 1 to begin, or chained 3 I should say, but it counts as a double crochet. You do not chain in between split shells. Instead you just find the very next space, the big space, and you work 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, all into that one big space. you should have something that looks like that. You're going to work this cute little split shell all the way down the first side, the first short side of your wrap, and I'll see you at the bottom. Once you've worked that split shell pattern all the way down your first short edge, you should have something that looks like this. So you have a split shell worked into each of those large spaces. So we're skipping the little spaces, we're only focusing on the big spaces. You may also find that this border row wants to ripple a little bit or stretch your pattern back out. This is something that's quite common with a fine weight yarn and a big lacy stitch pattern. It does have quite a bit of stretch to it. So when you're finished working the entire wrap, I highly recommend that you steam block or wet block your wrap in order to have the proper drape happen. It will stretch out all of your stitches and make that pattern a lot more even, and you won't have any rippling along the edge when you're finished with your border. When you get to a corner space, and here we are down to the first corner space at the end of our first short row, and there's our little tail that began the whole thing. I'm going to get that out of the way here. Every corner space is treated the same way. We begin with a split shell into it, which of course is 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet. And now we want to create a nice big corner space for the next row. So we're going to chain 4. That's going to create a nice big space for us going forward. But before we leave this corner space, we want to work another split shell into it. So this split shell finishes the short side. You chain 4 for the corner space for the next row. And now you want to begin the bottom row, which needs to begin with a split shell. So we work 2 more double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet into that same space before we leave it. All right, every corner space will be treated the same way. You will put a split shell in it, chain 4, and put another split shell in it before you continue on. You can worry about weaving in your little short tail later, or you can work over top of it as you work. I will be weaving mine back in underneath those stitches, so I'm going to ignore it for the rest of it. And then you just continue the pattern as normal. Look for the big space, so big spaces only, and work a split shell into it. 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, all the way across the bottom. Once you've worked all the way across the bottom of your shawl and you get to the corner, you're going to work that corner trig. So it's a split shell, 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, a chain 4, and another split shell, 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, all worked into that same big corner space. Then you continue the split shell pattern all the way up the second side, so just like the opposite side. That brings you up to the second last corner. So you work a split shell, chain 4, and a split shell all into that same corner. And now you're working across the last row of the wrap that you did. When you get all the way back to the beginning, you need to complete the corner that we began when we started our border row. So here's the last space. This is where we began the border. So we chained 3 and finished the split shell. So we want to work a split shell into that same space. This is the first corner space that we began in. So we work 2 double crochet, chain 2, and 2 double crochet into that corner space. Now remember, your corner isn't finished until you have that chain 4. So we chain 4, and then we're going to join to the top of the chain 3 that we began the entire border row with. If you want to finish, You can finish at this point, so if your shawl was already as long and as wide as you wanted it to be, there is your pretty little shawl border edge. You can fasten off, weave in your tails, and then go about blocking it, either wet blocking it or steam blocking it to allow for a nice drape. Or if you want to add more border, like I'm going to, we do the following. We chain 3 to begin. We're going to turn our work. We are now going in the opposite direction. So the second border, every border row you do, you're just going to flip directions of your shawl. So you're always beginning by working into that chain 4 corner. So we chained 3, we flipped our shawl, so we're working in the opposite direction now. And we're going to work the entire corner before we continue. So we finish the first split shell by working a double crochet, chaining 2, and working 2 more double crochet into that corner space. So the chain 3 that began the row counts as a double crochet. So that's our first little split shell worked into our chain 4 corner space. We're going to chain 4, and we're going to complete the corner by working another split shell into that corner space. So it's a smaller space than the previous row, but that's okay. And there's our new corner completed. So we begin with a split shell, chain 3, double crochet to start the first split shell, complete it, work a chain 4, and then another split shell all into that little corner space. And the rest of it is just smooth sailing into every chain 2 space, which is the center of a split shell. So ignore the spaces between split shells. You're only working a split shell into the top of a split shell from the previous row. So you work 2 double crochet, chain 2, and 2 double crochet, a split shell into the top of every single split shell all the way along each side. So there's no chaining in between shells. You're only working into the split shell from the row previous, so you skip over, find the next split shell from the previous row, and work a split shell into the very middle of it. When you've finished your second row of border, or any border row if you want to add more after this point, you finish your last split shell. That brings you up against the first split shell that began the entire row, because remember, we began in a corner space and we completed the entire corner, which is split shell, chain 4, split shell, before we moved on. So you want to join with a slip stitch to the top of that chain 3 that you began the row with. And then, because we want to be able to start in the middle of a split shell, doesn't have to be the corner, but you can work in the corner if you want, I'm going to slip stitch across to the center of that split shell. Now remember, this isn't the corner, this is the corner, and if you have trouble kind of keeping track, you might want to mark your corner spaces with stitch markers just so you know it's a corner space when you get to it. But we want to flip our wrap for each border row. So I'm going to chain 3 out of the center of this split shell right here. I'm going to turn my wrap around. I'm going to start working in the opposite direction, but before I leave, I'm going to finish the split shell in the top of this particular split shell. So I've chained 3, that counts as a double crochet. I'm going to double crochet, chain 2 more, and double crochet into the top of that split shell. But remember, now I'm going in the opposite direction. So when I get back round to the end of this row, the last thing I do, and here's my chain 4 space, will be to complete that corner and then join it to the top of that chain 3. But I'm flipped my work, I'm working in the opposite direction, so I'm just working regular split shells now all the way down that side. Corners are still treated the same way. When you get to a chain 4 corner, you work a split shell, chain 4, and a split shell into it. And that chain 4 sets you up for corner work down the road. So I'm going to continue adding border rows now. Remember that you're going to join with a slip stitch to the top of your chain 3. Always slip stitch into a space so that the middle of your split shell, chain 3 and flip your work. Flip your work every row so that you're always going in the opposite direction from the way you went in the row previous. That's just going to kind of help keep the edging nice and smooth. It's not going to want to curl in one direction. And we're flipping our blanket every row when we were working it initially. So we're kind of keeping that same pattern going. You can add as many rows of border as you like, Or you can be finished with just 2 rows, or even just 1. It's entirely up to you. It depends on how long and how wide you want your wrap. So go ahead, add as many border rows as you like, and then you can join with a slip stitch when you're done, fasten off, and weave in your tails. And I'll show you what that looks like when I get there. I have worked 4 rows of the border split shell pattern, and I've just joined my work to the top of the chain 3 that began my row. Every row I chained 3 and turned, so I was always going the opposite direction of the row before that. And it helps to create a nice even border that lays flat and doesn't want to curl one way or the other. Once you've decided you've got enough border on, you can trim your yarn, fasten off, and then you want to grab a yarn needle or a needle with an eye large enough or small enough in this case that your yarn can pass through, and then you just want to go about picking up the backs of stitches from the row previous. And take your time if you're using a slightly larger yarn needle like I am here. And then you can just weave your yarn back and forth through those stitches. Taking care not to pull too tightly because you don't want to pull the whole thing out of alignment. And then just double back on those stitches and go back the opposite way. And you want to weave your tail in back and forth a few times until you're pretty sure that it's not going to come undone. I want to add that when you're finishing off a wearable item, it helps to block the project. Blocking helps a project hang properly, especially something like a shawl or a wrap or a sweater. If you've never blocked a crochet or knitting project before, we have tutorials on how to steam block and how to wet block, and we'll put links to both of those in the description box down below. You can check them out if you've never blocked anything before. It's a very simple thing to do, and it does help make it look nice. And if you're using an acrylic blend yarn like the Summer Nights, then you can use either technique. It doesn't matter. And of course, the end results look very, very pretty indeed. And there you have it, a beautiful, delicate, summery shawl using our Old Country Bridges stitch, a simple little split shell border, and Summer Nights by Lion Brand Yarns. Thank you so much for tuning in this week and for making this lovely little shawl along with us, and we hope to see you soon here on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have an awesome week, everybody. Bye!